Every American kid learns the same story in history class. June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrila Princip steps out of a deli in Sarajevo, levels a pistol at the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and pulls the trigger twice. Within 6 weeks, the entire civilized world is at war. Within 4 years, 16 million people are dead. That's the story. That's the textbook version. And here's the problem with it. It's not wrong, it's just dangerously incomplete. Because here's what your history teacher didn't tell you. That bullet didn't start World War I the way a match starts a fire. It was more like a spark landing in a room that had been soaking in gasoline for 30 years. And the people who filled that room with gasoline, they weren't emperors, they weren't generals, they weren't even politicians, they were bankers. We were talking about the most powerful financial institutions in the world, the Rothschilds of London and Paris, the House of Morgan in New York, Deutsche Bank in Berlin, Crédit Lyonnais in Paris, firms that had spent decades weaving a web of sovereign loans, colonial debt, and secret financial arrangements so tight that by 1914, no European nation could afford peace, and no American bank could afford to stay neutral. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the financial architecture of World War I, the empire debt spiral that made conflict inevitable, the gold standard trap that turned a regional crisis into a global catastrophe, the secret treaty clauses that were really just loan agreements dressed in diplomatic language, and the single $500 million deal brokered by J.P. Morgan Jr. that quietly dragged the United States into the bloodiest war in human history up to that point. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll never read a history book the same way again. And more importantly, you'll start seeing the same fingerprints on every major conflict of the 20th and 21st century to understand how bankers engineered the conditions for World War I. You have to go back to the late 1800s, a period most Americans associate with the Wild West, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age. But over in Europe, something far more consequential was happening. The greatest land grab in human history. Between roughly 1870 and 1914, a period historians call the New Imperialism, the major European powers carved up nearly the entire African and Asian continents between them. Britain controlled about a quarter of the world's land surface. France dominated West Africa and Indochina. Germany, a unified nation only since 1871, was scrambling for whatever was left. Tanganyika, Namibia, Togo, pieces of the Pacific. Now here's the question your textbook glosses over. How did they pay for all of this? Building an empire is extraordinarily expensive. You need railways through jungle terrain, forts in hostile deserts, ongoing military campaigns against populations who, understandably, don't want to be colonized, administrative bureaucracies, naval fleets to protect shipping lanes. None of this comes cheap. The answer is that they borrowed, massively, recklessly, repeatedly. Britain, the dominant empire of the era, the nation on which the sun famously never set, had accumulated debt, worth billions of pounds by 1900. Much of it flowed through the private merchant banks of the City of London, the Rothschilds, whose network stretched from London to Paris to Vienna to Frankfurt, essentially acted as the central bank of empire, underwriting government bonds, financing colonial infrastructure, and collecting interest from London to Lagos. Barings Bank, one of the oldest and most respected financial houses in Britain, had already nearly collapsed in 1890 after overextending itself on Argentine railway bonds. A preview of the sovereign debt crises that would define the 20th century. They survived only because the Bank of England organized a consortium bailout. Sound familiar? Across the Atlantic, J.P. Morgan and Company was watching Europe with the intense focus of a predator studying a wounded animal. Morgan had already reshaped American finance, bailing out the U.S. Treasury in 1895, reorganizing the railroads, engineering the creation of U.S. Steel. Now he was eyeing the enormous appetite of European governments for capital. Germany's situation was particularly acute. Unified just in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, Germany was an industrial powerhouse that had arrived late to the colonial table. Their navy budget was ballooning. Kaiser Wilhelm II was engaged in a direct arms race with Britain, building dreadnoughts at a pace that terrified London. By 1913, Germany's external debt had reached 20 billion marks, much of it channeled through the Reichsbank and private houses like Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank. Russia was perhaps the most vulnerable of all. Tsar Nicholas II was borrowing heavily from French banks, primarily through the Crédit Lyonnais and Banque de Paris et des Pays, to finance everything from railroad construction to military modernization. By 1914, Russia owed French creditors approximately 6 billion francs in outstanding bonds. This wasn't just a financial relationship, it was a lever. French bankers could and did use that leverage to influence Russian foreign policy, pushing St. Petersburg toward agreements that served Paris's strategic interests. This is the crucial insight that most history books miss. The alliance system of 1914 was just about military treaties and diplomatic obligations. It was a debt map. Nations were bound together, not just by signatures on paper, but by billions in outstanding loans, interest payments, and the terrifying prospect of default. And the banks, they loved every minute of it. More tension meant more borrowing. More borrowing meant higher interest rates. Higher interest rates meant greater profits for the houses of Morgan, Rothschild, and their counterparts across Europe. By 1914, the entire financial system had a structural interest in instability, not war, necessarily, but the constant low-grade anxiety that kept sovereign borrowers coming back to the table. Now we need to talk about the gold standard, because this is the mechanism that turned a debt crisis into a doomsday machine, and most people have never heard a clear explanation of how it worked or why it mattered in 1914. The gold standard, which most major powers had adopted by the 1870s, worked like this. Every nation's paper currency was directly convertible into a fixed amount of gold. 1 British pound would get you a set quantity of gold. Same with German marks, French francs, Russian rubles, American dollars. This made international trade predictable and efficient. It also made the entire global financial system rigid as a steel rod and just as likely to snap under pressure. Here's the problem. Gold is finite. It doesn't grow. And the demands of industrial capitalism, constant expansion. Investment infrastructure required ever-increasing amounts of capital. The only way to get more capital was to mine more gold, which was slow and expensive, or to borrow, which created more paper claims on the same underlying gold reserves. Britain controlled approximately 40% of the world's accessible gold supply in 1914, much of it flowing in from South African mines following the Boer War, Germany's Reichsbank vaults. By contrast, were running dangerously low after the enormous expenditures of naval expansion. This asymmetry was a constant source of tension. When diplomatic crises flared, and they flared with increasing frequency after 1905, something predictable happened. Capital fled to safety. Investors pulled money out of riskier sovereign bonds and into British gilts, or, increasingly, American securities. Gold followed the capital. Nations that were already cash-strapped saw their reserves drained further. Central banks jacked up interest rates to attract gold back, which meant ordinary businesses, a Berlin manufacturer, a French farmer, or a Russian merchant, suddenly couldn't get affordable credit. The 1911 Agadir crisis is a perfect example. France and Germany nearly went to war over Morocco, ostensibly about a German gunboat and French imperial ambitions, but fundamentally about phosphate deposits and colonial trade routes. During the weeks of that crisis, gold poured out of German and French banks at an alarming rate. Credit tightened across Europe. Unemployment ticked up. Bread prices rose. The financial system was broadcasting, in the clearest possible terms, that it could not sustain prolonged imperial rivalry, yet every nation's economic structure demanded more of it. This created what economists call a negative feedback loop, for what the people living through it experienced as a vice slowly tightening around their throats. The only escape appeared to be more colonies, more gold mines, more captive markets, more raw materials to feed the industrial machine. But colonies were zero-sum. Every French gain in North Africa was a German loss. Every British advantage in the Persian Gulf was a Russian grievance. The gold standard didn't cause World War I, but it made a peaceful resolution of the underlying tensions nearly impossible, because the financial pain of de-escalation, letting rivals access markets, stepping back from colonial claims, was immediate and severe, while the financial rewards of going to war appeared, to those doing the calculations in 1914, to be potentially enormous. Those calculations were catastrophically wrong, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Those calculations were catastrophically wrong, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Here's where the story gets truly sinister, and where the line between diplomacy and financial scheming becomes essentially invisible. Most Americans have a vague awareness that Europe in 1914 was divided into alliance blocs, the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia on one side, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. What almost nobody learns is that these alliances were held together not primarily by shared ideology or ethnic solidarity, but by financial arrangements, loans, credit lines, and economic guarantees hidden in classified annexes that the public would not see for decades. Take Bismarck's Reinsurance Treaty of 1887. This was a secret agreement between Germany and Russia, promising German neutrality if Russia went to war with Austria-Hungary as long as France wasn't the aggressor. The treaty was kept hidden from Austria-Hungary, Germany's supposed ally, because Bismarck was running a double game designed to prevent a two-front war. When Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck in 1890 and allowed the treaty to lapse, he triggered a chain of events that pushed Russia directly into the arms of France and into French banks. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, the agreement that would ultimately drag France into a war with Germany following Russian mobilization in 1914, was cemented as much by French loans as by shared strategic interests. The French government and its bankers understood perfectly that if Russia defaulted, French savers who had purchased Russian bonds would be wiped out. Backing Russia in a crisis wasn't just an honorable obligation, it was an act of financial self-preservation. The 1915 Treaty of London, through which Britain, France, and Russia bribed Italy away from its nominal alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, is even more explicit. Italy received promises of territorial gains in Dalmatia, Albania, and along the Adriatic coast, but tucked into the agreement was a financial provision, a substantial credit line from Allied banks to shore up the Italian economy, which was struggling badly under the strain of anticipated mobilization. The Italians weren't just joining a cause, they were taking a loan package. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which Britain and France secretly divided the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire between themselves, is now infamous for its role in creating the modern Middle East's borders. Less discussed is the financial architecture behind it. The agreement was designed to give each power control of specific oil-bearing regions and trade routes, with the implicit understanding that these territories would service the war debts both nations were accumulating at a terrifying rate. These weren't rogue decisions made by cynical politicians. They were the logical outcomes of a system in which governments had become so financially entangled with private banks that national strategy and creditor interests had become functionally indistinguishable. Germany, increasingly boxed out of the Allied credit system, turned inward. Berlin began lending aggressively to Austria-Hungary, controlling roughly 71% of Austro-Hungarian external debt by the war's end, while simultaneously draining Vienna's gold reserves to prop up its own Reichsbank. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, a predatory financial relationship between supposed allies. Austria-Hungary needed German credit to keep functioning. Germany needed Austrian territory as collateral. Both needed war to escape the debt spiral they were trapped in. And now we get to the part that should make every American stop and think hard about what we were actually fighting. For in 1917, when war broke out in August 1914, the official position of the United States was neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson declared it formally. The American public largely supported it. The country was, by any reasonable measure, not involved in a European dynastic and imperial conflict that had nothing directly to do with American interests or American lives. But one institution had a very different perspective: J.P. Morgan and Company at 23 Wall Street, New York City. The Morgans had deep, long-standing relationships with the British and French financial establishments. John Pierpont Morgan Sr., the original Titan, had died in 1913, but his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack, had inherited both the firm and the relationships. When Britain and France began looking for ways to finance what they assumed would be a short, decisive war, they turned first to Morgan. Morgan S. Fern became the exclusive purchasing agent for the Allied governments in the United States, a role that gave them an almost incomprehensible amount of commercial power. Everything the British and French needed from American munitions, food, steel, chemicals, horses, leather goods, was purchased through J.P. Morgan and Company. By 1917, that purchasing operation had funneled approximately $3 billion worth of American goods to the Allied war effort. In today's dollars, we're talking about $80 to $90 billion through one firm. But purchasing agents need to be paid, and paying required loans. In September 1915, after months of negotiation and over the explicit objections of Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who correctly argued that such loans would compromise American neutrality, J.P. Morgan and Company issued a $500 million bond for Britain and France. It was, at that time, the largest foreign bond issue in the history of American capital markets. The Rothschilds participated from the London side, wiring funds to keep the arrangement liquid. Why did Morgan take the risk? The answer, according to internal firm correspondence reviewed by the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, popularly known as the NII Committee in the mid-1930s, was coldly rational. If the Allies lost, the loans would default. The British and French governments would be unable to repay. Morgan partners had calculated, quite precisely, that a German victory meant financial catastrophe for their firm and, through the web of correspondent banking relationships, for a significant portion of American finance. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented. The NII Committee established clearly that by late 1916, the Morgan loans had created a situation where American economic stability was materially dependent on an Allied victory. The logic that followed was almost inevitable: default on Morgan's billions, and the U.S. economy takes a devastating hit. Back the Allies to victory, and the loans get repaid with interest. When Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917, His public justification was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, a German proposal to Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Both were real. Both were legitimate grievances. But the financial architecture that made American intervention economically imperative had been constructed 3 years earlier in a suite of offices at 23 Wall Street. America didn't just enter World War I to make the world safe for democracy. America entered World War I, at least in part, to make the world safe for J.P. Morgan's balance sheet. Let's talk about money specifically, the almost incomprehensible amounts of it that changed hands between 1914 and 1918, and who ended up on which side of the ledger. The total direct cost of World War I has been estimated at approximately $288 billion in 1918. A figure so large it is almost meaningless without context. For reference, the entire U.S. federal budget in 1914 was about $735 million. The war cost roughly 400 times a single year of American government spending at the time. How is this paid for? Not, primarily, through taxes. Taxes covered a fraction of the actual expenditures. The vast majority was financed through bonds, government debt instruments sold to the public, to banks, to insurance companies, and to each other. In the United States, 4 rounds of Liberty loan drives raised approximately $17 billion between 1917 and 1918, with another $6 billion raised through victory bonds after the armistice. These were sold with aggressive, patriotic marketing posters of brave doughboys, appeals to mothers and grandmothers, school bond buying competitions. Who underwrote these bonds? Who collected the commissions on these massive debt issuances? The same houses that had been financing the lead-up to the war, Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., First National Bank of New York, and their counterparts in London and Paris. By 1916, Britain had essentially exhausted its financial resources. Its overseas investments, the accumulated wealth of a century of imperial extraction, were being liquidated to pay for the war. Canadian railways, American utilities, South African mines, all sold off to American investors at distressed prices, with Morgan's firm acting as broker. Britain went from being the world's largest creditor nation to its largest debtor in the span of 4 years. By 1918, the United States had replaced Britain as the center of global finance. American banks held the debt of every major combatant nation the New York Federal Reserve established, conveniently just 1 year before the war began. In 1913 was positioned to become the lender of last resort for the entire international monetary system. This transition was not an accident of history. It was the logical outcome of decades of deliberate financial strategy by American institutions that understood, with remarkable clarity, that British imperial finance was unsustainable, and that the next world financial hegemon would be whoever stepped in when it collapsed. For ordinary people, the American doughboy who shipped out to France, the British Tommy who drowned in the mud at Passchendaele, the French poilu who held the line at Verdun for 4 years, the war was an unmitigated catastrophe. Letters from the front speak of rats in the trenches, of friends dying of gas attacks, of absurdist horror that no civilian back home could comprehend. For the houses of Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb, and their equivalents in London and Paris, the ledgers told a very different story. Commission fees, interest payments, bond management fees, currency exchange profits, and, for the Americans in particular, the acquisition of British overseas assets at fire sale prices. If the financial architecture of 1914 built World War I, the financial architecture of 1919 built World War II, and the link between them is so direct that it's almost incomprehensible, that it is unto the central lesson of every high school history curriculum in America. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 19, imposed on Germany what historian John Maynard Keynes, who was actually present at the negotiations as part of the British delegation, called a Carthaginian peace. In his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, Keynes argued, with devastating precision, that the reparations imposed on Germany was so far beyond German economic capacity to pay that they would inevitably produce either a political explosion or another war, or both. He was right on both counts. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, equivalent to roughly $500 billion today. This was to be paid to France, Britain, Belgium, and the other allied nations, who then needed those payments to service their own war debts to American banks. The financial chain was explicit. German reparations flowed to allied governments, which used them to repay Morgan and his counterparts in New York, to pay the reparations. Germany had to export, but the Allied powers had set up tariff barriers that made it extremely difficult for Germany to compete in export markets. To generate hard currency, Germany's central bank, the Reichsbank, began printing. By November 1923, the German inflation crisis had reached such an extreme that a loaf of bread cost more than 200 billion marks, wheelbarrows of currency for a week's groceries. Life savings wiped out overnight. The Dawes Plan of 1924 attempted to restructure the reparations payments, and significantly, it was organized through American banks, with Morgan's firm again playing a central role. American loans flowed to Germany. Germany used them to pay reparations. Britain and France used those reparations to pay their war debts to American banks. The entire system was circular, dependent on a continuous flow of American credit, and intrinsically fragile. When that flow stopped, as it did, catastrophically, after the Wall Street crash of October 1929, the entire edifice collapsed. German unemployment hit 30%. The reparations payments became impossible. Political extremism, which had been building for a decade, found its moment. A failed Austrian artist and decorated war veteran, convinced that Germany had been stabbed in the back by Jewish financiers, began his ascent to power. The financial decisions made in the smoke-filled rooms of 1914, the loans, secret treaties, the gold standard rigidities, the Morgan bond deals created Versailles. Versailles created the Weimar crisis. The Weimar crisis created Adolf Hitler. The chain is direct, documented, and largely unteachable in standard curricula because it implicates institutions and interests that remain, to this day, extraordinarily powerful. So why are we talking about all of this today? What does a financial crisis from a century ago have to do with your life in the United States in 2026? Everything. Literally everything. The financial architecture that produced World War I did UNT disappear in 1918 or 1945 or with the end of the Cold War. It evolved, adapted, and in many respects became more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in the structures of American and global power. The specific mechanisms changed. The fundamental dynamic private financial interests shaping, and in some cases determining, national security policy did not. Consider the military-industrial complex, which President Dwight Eisenhower famously warned about in his 1961 farewell address. Eisenhower was a five-star general who had commanded the largest military operation in history. He didn't warn about this complex because he was a naive idealist. He warned about it because he had seen firsthand how defense contractors, financial institutions, and government procurement had become so thoroughly intertwined that it was genuinely difficult to determine where public policy ended and private profit began. The pattern Eisenhower described had its template in the Morgan Purchasing Agency of 1914 to 1917. The United States did UNT just enter that war. Its entire industrial and financial economy was reorganized around supporting it and the entities that orchestrated that reorganization profited enormously from doing so. Look at modern arms deals. When the United States provides military aid to a foreign government, whether it's Ukraine, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, or Israel, that aid does not materialize out of thin air. It flows through defense contractors whose stock prices rise with each new authorization. It's financed through treasury bonds underwritten by financial institutions. It creates procurement contracts that flow to specific congressional districts, ensuring that the political support for those expenditures remains stable regardless of their strategic merit. The IMF bailouts that Eisenhower's successors would deploy throughout the Cold War and beyond, Greek bailouts, Argentine bailouts, structural adjustment programs from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia follow the same structural logic as the Franco-Russian loans of the 1890s. Credit as leverage, debt as policy instrument, financial dependency as a substitute for military occupation. The sanctions regimes applied to Russia after 2022, to Iran since 1979, to Cuba since 1962. These are, in a very real sense, the modern equivalent of Britain's naval blockade of Germany. In 1914, economic warfare is strategic competition. The goal in each case is not just to harm the target economy but to force a change in political behavior by making the financial cost of current policy unsustainable. And the banks? They're still there. J.P. Morgan Chase, the direct institutional descendant of J.P. Morgan and Company, remains the largest bank in the United States and one of the largest in the world. The Rothschild Group continues to advise governments on sovereign debt restructuring. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley staff the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the National Economic Council with a regularity that would be remarkable in any other country. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is public information, verifiable in annual reports, SEC filings, congressional testimony, and press releases. The revolving door between finance and government security policy is not secret. It is, in many respects, celebrated as evidence of expertise and competence. The same question that the evidence of 1914 forces us to ask is whether a system in which the financial interests of private institutions are so thoroughly intertwined with decisions about war and peace can ever reliably prioritize the lives of ordinary people over the returns on sovereign bond portfolios. History suggests the answer is not reliably, not consistently, and certainly not when the pressure is on. We began this video with a gunshot in Sarajevo. I want to end it somewhat different. There are walls all across America and Europe with names carved into them. the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington, the Thiepval Memorial in France, where the names of 72,000 British soldiers who died on the Somme and have no known graves are inscribed in stone. 72,000 names from one battle that lasted 5 months. Those names represent a human cost that no financial analysis can adequately capture. The grieving mothers, the children who grew up without fathers, the young men who came back from the trenches unable to sleep, unable to work, unable to explain to people who hadn't been there what they had seen. But those names also represent a decision, a series of decisions, made over 30 years leading up to August 1914 by people who were never going to be on any memorial wall. Decisions made in the paneled offices of merchant banks in London and Frankfurt, in the private dining rooms of financial houses in New York and Paris, by men who understood, with perfect clarity, the financial logic of what they were constructing, and who chose to construct it anyway. The textbook version of World War I is about nationalism and imperialism and the tragic mechanics of alliance systems. All of that is true, but it's incomplete in a way that serves the interests of the institutions responsible for those decisions. The Fuller version, the version supported by the documentary record, by the Senate testimony of the 1930s, by the work of economic historians from Keynes forward, is about a financial system that had structurally incentivized conflict, that had made national sovereignty contingent on the preferences of private creditors, and that had distributed the rewards of war to those with the least skin in the game, while distributing its costs to those with the most. Your great-grandfather, if he was of the right age and background, may have shipped out from an American port in 1917, convinced he was going to make the world safe for democracy, to use Wilson's phrase. He may have come back changed or not come back at all. Either way, J.P. Morgan Jr. collected his commission. That's not cynicism, that's the receipts. The war to end all wars ended in November 1918. The financial structures that produced it were rebuilt almost immediately, adapted and deployed again in 1939, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq. The mechanisms are different in their specifics. The underlying logic is unchanged. If you want to understand why wars happen and, more importantly, whether they could happen differently, you cannot stop with a gunshot in Sarajevo. You have to follow the money, all the way back to the bank. This has been a deep dive into the financial origins of World War I. If this changed how you see history, or how you see the news, drop a comment below. Share this with someone who thinks textbooks tell the whole story, and subscribe, because we're just getting started. Next time, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the year before the war. Was that a coincidence? The answer might surprise you. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, history isn't just what happened. It's what was written down, by whom, and who paid for the ink.